Please like and subscribe to Anything Agriculture. It is important that we continue to make good content for you, so if you like and subscribe, I can continue to do that. Thank you. In this video, we're going to talk a little bit about how forages factor into your rotational grazing plan. If you're looking for a pasture that's going to do it all, you might be a little disappointed. If you plan your forages for grazing or hay making, you need to plant accordingly. Doing it all is going to stress out your land and your pastures. So you need to make some decisions about what you want your land to do for you. But with some good soil conditions, some really good species selection, and some favorable weather, and some hard work, you can achieve what you need to with your rotational grazing plan. Whether you're starting from scratch or you're renovating an existing pasture, you need to know what's going to work for your operation. The number one thing to know is to get a soil test. Do a soil test. I can't say this enough. I have a soil testing video. It's not very hard. It's not very expensive. And it gives you a boatload of information on how to make your land the most productive it can be. It is important to understand that in your rotational grazing operation, you need to pick between having a mixed stand versus a pure stand of forages. And we'll discuss a little bit more later on what that means and the advantages and disadvantages of both. Most rotational grazing operations go with mixed stands, and that is because a lot of times they're renovating a pasture that's already a mixed stand, and there are advantages to that. Some of the pros are you'll need lower nitrogen fertilizer if you're mixing your stand with legumes. It reduces frost heaving, it reduces erosion, improves livestock health and quality. It can help the forages be a little more climate resistant. The disadvantages are legumes, if you put them in your mixed stand, will need to be reseeded more often and will take a little longer to establish. We're going to talk about forage groups, and we lump our forages into cool season grasses, warm season grasses, and legumes. In addition to that groupings, we also have perennial versus annual forages. And again, these all have places in a rotational grazing system depending on what your goals are. This is my PSA. Please avoid pre-mixes or pre-packaged mixes of pasture grasses or pasture seed. This is a huge waste of money. These are put together by weight. And that doesn't sound like a bad thing when you look at the tags and it'll say something like Timothy grass is 25% and alfalfa is 5%. That's fine, except that Timothy seeds are very, very, very tiny. And so it's going to take a lot more Timothy seeds to make up a pound than it is alfalfa seeds to make up a pound. So if you have pound for pound, you will get more Timothy than alfalfa, and Timothy will actually outcompete the alfalfa. So when you're looking at prepackaged mixes, they are most often, they'll have a lot of wheat seeds in them as well, but most often they're not going to have what you're looking for. This is where I say seed size matters, because if you look at this little chart, you can see that the seed sizes change dramatically based on the variety. So your Bermuda grass is very, very tiny, and here's your perennial ryegrass, which is much larger. If you have them pound for pound, you are going to have more Bermuda grass seed in a pound than you are perennial ryegrass. What this boils down to is if you want a particular grass, you're going to want more seed, not necessarily more poundage, but more seed to get coverage. And when you buy a mix, a lot of times you're getting that per poundage. You may not get the seeds that you're wanting for your pastures. Germination rate also matters. An example is ryegrass tends to germinate between 3 to 5 days, whereas Kentucky bluegrass can take up to 3 weeks to germinate. This matters because if you've got a mix with ryegrass and Kentucky bluegrass, your ryegrass is going to be outcompeting that Kentucky bluegrass very quickly, and you have just spent money on Kentucky bluegrass that you're never going to see in your pastures. I'm going to talk a little bit about common forages in Indiana and throughout the Midwest. First, we're going to talk about cool season grasses. These are grasses that produce the most in cool seasons, so they generally are green during the spring and the fall. So common ones, and I'm sure you've heard of Kentucky bluegrass, orchard grass, canary reed grass, ryegrass, smooth brome grass, tall fescue, and timothy. And warm season grasses are great for your rotational grazing operation because these grasses thrive when it's hotter out, basically during the middle of the summer. In the middle of summer, your cool season grasses will go dormant and the warm season grasses will start to shine. Some of the really common ones that we see here in the Midwest and Indiana are big blue stem, eastern gamma grass, Indian grass, and switchgrass. Now, legumes are one of the things we need to talk about because they are very important to a mixed stand rotational grazing operation. Legumes do wonderful things. They're usually very high in protein and great for your animals, although you do have to watch for bloat. They are really good for the soil because they fix nitrogen out of the air and put it back into the soil, as well as use some for the plant. Legumes are often used for high performance animals. So some of the common legumes, obviously most people have heard of alfalfa and alfalfa hay, but alsky clover, bird's foot trefoil, and red clover are also common planted into mixed stands to get that legume component into your rotational grazing. I want to talk about native grasses. Native grasses have gotten a lot of press lately, and they do definitely have a place in rotational grazing. Sometimes they can be a little hard to put into a rotational grazing system, but I would like to see more people putting native grasses into rotational grazing. One of the main reasons is because native grasses have huge, healthy root systems. That makes them able to withstand droughts. That makes them better at erosion control. It also helps with water infiltration into the soil. So if you get big rains, more water will stay in the soil than run off. Native grasses tend to be fairly palatable, so most species will eat them. I want to talk a little bit about weeds. Now, I'm going to do some more videos about weeds and some more videos about forage selection, but weeds are generally in a pasture because the pasture has been overgrazed or hasn't been taken care of. Weeds are not good for your animals. Some people say, well, the weeds may have this, nutritional value, that nutritional value, but if an animal doesn't want to eat it, they're not going to. The only way they're going to eat it is if they don't have a choice. And that leads to other problems because not all weeds are good for you. We have noxious weeds, and these weeds are terrible for animals and they can cause poisonings. So not only do you have not healthy animals because they're not eating the right thing, but now you've also poisoned animals, and so you might end up with dead animals or very large vet bills. Now that we've reviewed some of the options you have for forages in your rotational grazing operation, now it's time to try and put it all together. And this can be a little tricky. I will have a video that will have more about each variety that I talked about in here, so you have to make a more informed decision about what might be right for your paddocks and for your operation. So for a quick review, we have cool season grasses, warm season grasses, and legumes. And cool season grasses are grasses that like it cool, so in the fall and in the spring, they are the greenest, luscious, and healthiest. Warm season grasses thrive when it's hot, during the summer, when your cool season grasses have finally gone dormant. And legumes are plants that will have really high protein, and they are great in a mix. We also have to think about which ones are perennial and which ones are annual. Annual grasses and legumes will need to be reseeded every year. Perennial, you may get a few years out of each one, depending on how heavily you're grazing and what your goals are. Now you need to determine what your nutritional need is for your animals. Are your animals going to market and need to make market weight? Are they lactating and dairy animals and they need to produce milk? Or do you have pleasure animals that need an enrichment environment? All of these factors will be important to what kinds of forages you will choose. Now, I'm going to do an example, and this will help you think through the process. Here is a rotational grazing diagram that I found that helps explain visually how rotational grazing works and what you're trying to do. So essentially you are taking your herd or your flock and you are moving them to paddocks. They're grazing those paddocks completely down, and that paddock will rest when the herd and flock move to another paddock to eat that vegetation. The resting helps regrow the vegetation. It helps reduce soil erosion, helps create big root systems, helps with water pollution, as in runoff. It actually also helps with water penetration into your soil. It is good for your soil health, and it improves your livestock health. Process. Now, each grazing operation is unique, and this may work for you and this may not work for you, but it is a place to start. So one thing you want to do is whatever animal you're grazing, what is the market weight you're targeting and how long will your animals take to get to that weight? So that is number one. How long is it going to take? Then you need to look at how many paddocks you have. Hopefully you've decided on how many paddocks you can have. And at this time, size does matter. A larger paddock is going to be grazed a little more unevenly, but your animals may be able to be on it longer. And then you're going to take in consideration the season, spring, summer, fall, winter, because in those seasons, forages will have different nutritional availability. So like spring, a lot of times there's a lot of lush growth and a lot of calories and those kind of things. Summer, things kind of peter out a little bit, and that doesn't mean you can't have great grazing. It just means that you're not going to have that big lush growth. Fall, you will get another big lush flush of cool season grasses growing. And then winter, it's not uncommon for winter to be a very hard time for rotational grazing, but you can plan for it by storing forages in the field or having a paddock that you are going to take hay off of and be able to feed during the winter. So that's where you're going to kind of start thinking. And yeah, it's a little bit hard, but you can do it. So I'm going to tell you about an example of a farm that I worked with, and they worked with grazing goats for market, and it was a meat goat operation. So right away in the spring, they said they wanted a lot of legumes and stuff in the pasture and a lot of really nutritionally dense forages because their animals need to grow kind of rapidly and develop with a lot of nutrition in that first several weeks. Then after that, they wanted summer pastures. So they chose warm season grasses for just a summer pasture. And they were able to figure out how long they could be on the cool season grass pasture while their animals were developing. And they actually cut their pasture in two so that they could have more efficient grazing. Then they moved all the animals into a summer pasture where they grazed, and they grazed that down. Once that was grazed down, and that took about 6 weeks with how large their pastures they were working with, then a lot of the animals were ready to move on to a more cool season pasture because that was about the time when cool season grasses are starting to grow. And this would give those animals a real punch of more protein and more nutrition so that they could really get up to market weight. Then after that, then they had a winter pasture, and their winter paddock, they did store some forages, but they also had another paddock that they put in for just making hay. And it was actually a pure stand. And they would make hay off it one year, and then they would overplant it with legumes and use it into their rotational grazing the next year. And then one of the other paddocks that was in the rotational grazing the year before would become the hay pasture. And this is how they were able to overwinter their animals, their breeding stock, and the animals that they wanted to keep. But they needed a lot less because they had animals that were going to market already. So their herds were a lot less when winter came in the end of fall and winter. So there was a lot less pressure on their final rotational grazing paddock. And it worked great for them. They were able to increase their stocking rates quite a bit, and they were able to make a pretty good profit on it. Does this work for everybody? No. Can it work for you? It may, if that's what your operation is looking for. I want to touch briefly on the example in the summer pasture. They added pearl millet into their summer pastures. Pearl millet isn't actually a forage, it's actually a grain. This is something they discovered many years after they started rotational grazing, and it really helped their animals. Now, this brings me to a very important point. Every operation is different. All the animals are different. Your land is different. So your process and your goals are going to be different than anyone else's. If you make a fail, learn from it. And this is where networking with other people who are grazing really helps because they've made mistakes too. Learn from their mistakes, and this will make your operation better in the long run. So I hope you found this helpful for your small farm homesteading dreams. And as always, please like and subscribe to Anything Agriculture so I can continue to make content that matter to you.